The most fascinating thing, we find ourselves right now in the United States in a time of huge political discord. It seems that politicians who sit across from each other on each side of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, can agree on almost nothing. So it makes it all the more extraordinary that when we talk about human dignity and freedom for Iran, for the residents of Camp Liberty, that is the one issue here in Washington on which there is tremendous bipartisan support. It says a lot about the facts. This is an issue on which the facts are not in dispute. The residents of Camp Liberty deserve justice, and they have been denied justice. They have been made promises by multiple secretaries of state on both sides of the aisle, presidents from both sides of the aisle, across administrations. And those are promises that have not been kept. When U.S. soldiers were at Camp Liberty, before it became used for those who had to depart Ashraf, there were 17,500 T-walls, along with protective gear for the soldiers who were in Camp Liberty. The commitment was to maintain the security conditions at Camp Liberty when those who were forced to leave Ashraf had to establish themselves there. Eventually, Iraq permitted some T-walls to be brought in, but it wasn't 17,500. It was 1,160. When the U.S. government actually pressures the Iraqis, they permit some small incremental security measure to be taken. The Iraqi government has been complicit in the violence that's been visited upon Liberty. Not only have they been complicit, frankly, they claim they're not involved. It is inconceivable that inside Iraq, the level of violence that's been visited upon Liberty could have happened without the active involvement and complicity of the Iraqi government. What about the September 1st attack on Ashraf? Scores were killed, and then we hear, only recently, the Iraqi government acknowledges that in a secret burial site, it buried 51 individuals. It won't say where. And you have to ask yourself, well, why would that be? Why would it be a secret place? Why would they not reveal the location? Why would they have done it without notification prior to the burial? And one can only presume that was because they wanted to prevent autopsies, they wanted to prevent documentation of torture and murder. Those who remain, what are their conditions? Well, over the last few months, Iraqi forces have not permitted septic tanks to be cleaned. They have not permitted food trucks to come in. And on many occasions, including immediately after attacks where people were injured and dying, the Iraqi medical clinic set up inside the camp, which referred those residents who were injured and dying and ill to the hospital outside the camp for treatment. Those people were stopped by Iraqi forces from getting the medical treatment they so desperately needed. So when you hear Tom Ridge and you hear General Phillips and you hear me stand up, and we are clearly angry because we feel personally misled and we feel a sense of personal responsibility. It isn't enough that the administration delisted the MEK. It won't be enough until we fulfill our commitment to their safety and security. They are not a threat. And we have an obligation.
The inmates at Guantanamo Bay have better living conditions than the people who were at Ashraf and that were now have turned over to the Iraqis and are being kept at Camp Liberty. During phase 2, how many of the 3,400 do you think the FBI, the CIA, the DIA, and our other organizations wanted us to cull out, apprehend, so they could be charged? None. Not one. In June of 2004, all of those organizations left Ashraf and really left the Army holding the bag. It's like, what do we do now with these individuals? Well, are they terrorists? No. Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld sent us an order that said they are now protected persons under the Fourth Geneva Convention, and it was my unit that individually issued protected persons ID tags, and I was the first one to get an ID tag. I am ID tag number 1, and it was strictly to show them, hey, I will put my name on this too. We went on and tried our very best as the Army to get the Red Cross, to get the UNHCR, any organization in there to say, can you take care of these people? Can you get them out? None. When I went back in 2008, the only difference between the 3,400 that I originally detained is that some of them were dead. And now many more are dead. And I would ask you this, how are these people? Who are they? Young men and women, older men and women. But yet we have them confined there at Camp Liberty. We have turned them over to the Iraqis after promising. This is not just Philip saying this. We put that promise in writing. The United States government, that's our government, which I grew up and I believe in, that we have the moral high ground. I saw us come off that high ground, and we're still off that high ground. And any of you question anything about the conditions they're under, ask this question of our own State Department. Show me a picture of Camp Liberty, current. Let me ask one of the news people from my area, Cleveland, Nebraska, to go in and just film Camp Liberty. I guarantee you, you will be denied. We have had our own U.S. congressmen and senators go over to Baghdad and be refused to even see the condition these people are under. Well, we set the conditions for a modern-day concentration camp, and that's where these people are to this day that many of you don't even know about. It's time we lived up to what we promised them in 2003, protection. I would be happy to talk to any of you offline. These are real people there. And I can't overemphasize, my forces commanded at Guantanamo Bay. I know the conditions those individuals are under. The conditions that these people are under that we promised protection are far worse, and we're responsible for that. Picture yourself as a U.S. citizen in another country, and the United States government says, we'll take care of you. Well, 10 years ago, this is a picture I brought. You're looking at a table for Norouz, the Iranian New Year. This picture was taken of me and many of the Iranians in front of a similar table, only it was at Camp Ashraf. 10 years later, they're still in confinement, and very few of you even know about them. I'll let the others talk about the big picture. Thank you. Live up to our promises. I still believe in this country, and when we make a promise, we need to uphold it.
8 or 10 of us on a regular basis began communicating with a representative of the State Department by the name of Daniel Freed. Daniel Freed had been assigned the task of the responsibility of working with the United Nations, which has failed miserably in this regard, but we're not going to talk about them, failed miserably in their regard to live up to the promise of securing the appropriate safety embraced by the Maliki government, had failed in their responsibility to move these people from Ashraf to much safer places, had failed in their responsibility, frankly, for the longest time to simply take them off the terrorism list. But they are finally off the terrorism list. But at the end of the day, we were approached by the State Department, and I would tell you that it was a fairly prominent group of men and women whose names you'd probably realize. There was a former Attorney General of the United States by the name of Michael Mukasey, 2 very highly visible, very credible and important Democratic political figures, my friend and colleague, former Democratic governor of Pennsylvania, Ed Rendell, and former presidential candidate Howard Dean, and Louis Freeh, and a couple members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Rudy Giuliani, and the list goes on. And there were probably about 8 or 10 of us on a regular basis for 6 or 8 months had these conversations with the State Department, with our State Department, that allegedly represents our interest and was looking to represent the interest of the 3,000 plus men and women at the time at Ashraf. They beseeched, encouraged, convinced us to intervene on the behalf of the State Department, our State Department, to convince these men and women to leave the city they basically built. And I must tell you, it is rather remarkable. The diaspora of Iranians around the world had contributed hundreds of millions of dollars. They had a cultural center, they had workshops, they had schools, they built a city, there were all kinds of creature comforts. Convinced them to leave that facility to Camp Liberty, which had been an American base, ironically named at the present time. Now remember, it's our State Department, and we did. And by the way, they were shown by the United Nations photographs of Camp Liberty as it existed when the United States Army had occupied it. The amenities were plentiful, the sewage system was operational, they had electricity, they had 17,000 T-walls or whatever that number may be. It was safe, it was secure, it was humane, it was a step down from the city that these industrious, enterprising, able, well-educated, sophisticated people had met, but they moved. We convinced them to move. When they got there, they realized that the photos were not a distortion, it was an abject, bold-faced lie. They had gutted the place. No sewage, no water and sewer, no electricity, no security areas, and they had reduced the size of the camp almost a postage stamp, like trapped. On multiple occasions, the United States government, through its designated, elected, and appointed officials, have made commitments to the men and women in Ashraf, have made commitments to the men and women who are fortunately, their voices in this country and, frankly, around the world, and not a single commitment has been met. And we promise to provide for their safety and security. Some of us take this very personal. Very personal. Ladies and gentlemen, it's another thing to be disrespected around the world. And what's the quickest way to be disrespected? The quickest way for you to disrespect somebody else is for somebody to give you their word and go back on your word. I dare say, is there anything more important to you in your relationship with individuals, people you care about, people you know, business, personally, socially, if they say they're going to do something and they fail to do it, or if they're disingenuous, don't keep their promise? I think that's the quickest avenue to disrespect and repudiation down the road. So if we want to be disengaged, that's a foreign policy decision, but disrespected is another thing. And I dare say, the rest of the world knows the promises we made to these 3,400 at one time men and women in Ashraf in 2002 when we disarmed them. The rest of the world knows we promised them protection under the Fourth Geneva Convention. The rest of the world knows that we told Maliki, you've got to provide the safety and security. I'm hoping as much of the world knows is that they convinced several Americans to use their credibility and visibility to convince them to move liberty. The rest of the world knows that they're living in a concentration camp. And the rest of the world knows that even Secretary of State Clinton promised that they'd be safe and secure. And the rest of the world knows, as of today, as of March 12th, 2014, the United States of America has failed miserably to keep its word. And if you don't keep its word to political refugees who have surrendered their means of self-defense to you, how much credibility do you have in the broader world community on other issues? Oh, I know you don't know these 3,000 people, and it may just be a blip on the screen compared to the number of people getting assassinated and murdered and tortured and killed in Syria and elsewhere around the world. But None of those people did the United States government pledge to provide safety and security. So to the men and women who were on respective staffs, we share this insight, this perspective with you. If you have an opportunity to engage your congressman or senator about this critical issue, at the end of the day, the fate of these individuals rests in the hands not of Maliki, but in our hands. So I think maybe we ought to just discontinue aid for a while, put a little pressure on him. I think we're going to negotiate with the Iranians. We ought to send them a signal that once we make a commitment, we keep it. Let's get them out of there. Let's open the doors to a couple of them here. It's not a matter about being disengaged. It's about being disrespected. And as long as we fail to keep our word, there's no reason in the world why anybody should ever expect, could ever rely on American promise again. Thank you very much.
As this is a moral obligation, this is something we have to do. Don't wait for the courts. Don't wait for the White House. You are an independent branch of our government. You have the power to condition continued aid to Iraq on making them behave like civilized people toward this group of brave refugees. You have the power. You have the power to enforce a life and death contract that the United States government made with the residents of Camp Ashraf, that in exchange for their giving up their inherent right to defend themselves and their families, they gave up that right in exchange for a promise of protection. We have not protected them. Instead, we have exposed them to violence, to death, to injury. 52 murdered in cold blood, total of 116 killed, hundreds more wounded, 7 hostages taken, nearly 3,000 vulnerable to further attack. One of the first things put into the Constitution by Alexander Hamilton was the fact that you cannot broach contracts, you cannot violate contracts. That became an essential part of the America promise to the world. You do business with us, we will keep our promise. We will maintain our contracts. There is no good reason for why the United States has not kept its promise. There aren't even bad reasons, but we haven't been told what the reasons are. Instead, we get silence, we get circumlocution from people who can't justify their action. This is not a collateral issue. This is not a political peripheral issue. This is a central issue, morally, politically, and legally. Please do justice. Thank you very much.